Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 146. We're talking web authentication with Google Identity today. We are your hosts today, Justin Ribeiro, Danny Blue, Amal Hussein, Leon Revel. Hello, wonderful people.
Hey.
Hello, Justin.
Hi, everyone.
And before we introduce our guest this week, I'm going to throw it over to the news desk where Leon's going to tell us about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon?
Thank you, Justin. So first of all, the Web Platform Podcast has got a brand new website. You can go and see that at thewebplatformpodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe, or we'll send you weekly updates of the shows and also This Week in Web News. Mozilla have just announced their intent to implement custom elements, which is planned to be available in Firefox 59. This even includes customized built-in elements, which allows you to extend native elements. Neither Chrome or Safari currently ship with that feature. Mozilla also intend to implement Shadow DOM, which will be available in Firefox 60. So this is great news for web components, obviously. For those of you using WebStorm, version 2017.3 has just been released, which includes better support for Vue.js, which is great, new refactorings, a new REST client, and much more. There's some minor versions of React and Vue.js, which have just been released, and which include a range of bug fixes. With Skate.js, we're getting closer and closer to version 5, and we've now moved into beta releases of version 5 on GitHub. Slightly older news, Mozilla has released Firefox Quantum, which focuses on faster performance and less memory usage. I thought it was worth a shout out because they've done a really good job with that. And this is just a plug for a former guest, Mark Erickson. He's a Redux maintainer, and he's just released a new course on Educative titled Practical Redux. It's 50% off this week, and we'll send a code in the show notes.
Thank you, Leon. Some interesting stuff right there. I'm really excited about custom elements and finally Shadow DOM, if in 5960 it looks like, with those intents. I don't know about the rest of the panel, but they, yay!
Yay!
Standards! Danny's going, no shadow. We're not having that conversation today, Danny. Are we having that conversation today?
I've said that Shadow DOM is now fine. I still say Shadow DOM held back the rest of the spec, but
Well, if in a perfect world, all specs would land at once, and I could build a utopia of web goodness. But today we're not talking about utopias. Today we're talking about web authentication, which for some people is not a utopia, but rather a nightmare of things. And we've got a great guest today to talk about this with us, Mr. Alan Firstenberg. Hello, Alan. Good to see you.
Hello, Justin. Good to see you as always.
Introduce yourself to the general audience out there, for those who don't necessarily know you. We've known each other for quite a long time at this point, and we've done some things, but
it seems like forever at this point. No, so my name's Alan Firstenberg. I am a software developer. I work for a small consulting company, but I am also a Google developer expert in a wide variety of fields, including Google Assistant, Internet of Things, wearables, and what we're going to be talking about today, identity services.
Yeah, and you and I think we first met when we were both working on Glass a long, long time ago. You also wrote a book for O'Reilly on Glass, for those of you out there who remember what Google Glass was.
Wait, Justin, I think it's called The Book on Google Glass. It's not.
It's true.
Not necessarily
it was pretty much the book. I can't say that I ever got to write a book on it, but Alan's book was sort of the Bible of all things Glass, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, thank you. It was a great book to write. O'Reilly's always a good group of people to work with, and I just wish we had more of a chance to, sell it before it went off the market.
It is a shame. But alas, we have something new and wonderful with Google Identity and things and a web authentication, and that actually travels quite a bit across a lot of platforms, which we'll sort of get into. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of sort of that authentication things, maybe we should have a sort of short discussion on the topic of identity. It seems to be a somewhat confusing topic. A lot of people get bogged down in the weeds, if you will, on what identity is once you start talking about signatures and tokens and all kinds of things. But really, what is identity when we talk about users and things?
I think it's a really good question. And I think part of the reason why there's so much confusion around it is that even the people who are talking about providing identity services can't really put their finger on what identity means. When Eric Schmidt is, loudly pronouncing that Google is an identity provider, yet can't really explain what that means, we've got a lot of problems going on. The way I like to look at identity is just to say, okay, I as a website am talking to something or someone, hopefully someone, on the other end of a keyboard somewhere. In the broadest terms, who is that person? And sometimes that means I'm going to need to know their name and address and credit card. And sometimes that just means I want to make sure that this person is the same person as I was talking to yesterday. And, I don't necessarily need to know their name. I just want some reassurances that this is the same entity. And when you start saying same entity, that's when things start getting really confusing. How do you know that this is the same person? Is it really just, is it two people that both have the same authority to do the same thing, and therefore have the same login and password? Or, what is it? What are we dealing with here? And there's such a variety of types of entities on the other end, some of which are modeled very well in the real world, in a physical world, so we can create nice analogies, and some of which aren't. So we struggle a lot in trying to figure out what are we dealing with. The other important thing I think to deal with when we talk about identity, and when we start going down the security rabbit hole, is to say, how important is it that we know exactly who it is we're talking to? How important is it that we trust that we're talking to exactly the right entity on the other end? And some of that, is, well, how valuable is the information we're protecting? And other parts are, if I get it wrong, what are the risks? What are the concerns that I have? And how much effort do I as a developer, or I as a company, or I as a whatever, need to make sure that I'm talking to the right person on the other end of the line? And a lot of that is more of a philosophical question. It's a risk question, because there's no perfect answer. There's no perfect security or perfect identity solution. It's managing what is most appropriate for our needs and with the costs that we have. One of the good things is that we see a lot of the costs coming down, so it makes it easier for us to be more assured of who's on the other end. But there's no guarantee, and as developers, we need to accept that fact and figure out the best solution for right now.
That's like a thank you. That was such a great answer, and the right amount of philosophicalness around this topic that makes many people feel uncomfortable and scared, like I often do when I think about authentication and working with those services.
Well, here's a good thing. If you're not scared when you're asking security questions, you're not approaching it with the right frame of mind. Even for very simple tasks where you just want a simple login, you should be asking, am I getting the right information? Am I getting too much information? If I'm over asking for information about a user, am I now putting myself at risk later? Am I putting this user at risk? So, identity is a serious issue. There's a reason why, the term identity theft exists. So, even on a simple website or a simple app, if we're not approaching security and login and identity with the appropriate amount of trepidation, we're doing it wrong. The problem is figuring out what the appropriate amount of trepidation should be.
Today, it seems that identity is at the top of everybody's sort of list of things, and a lot of times it seems to get grouped in with the notion of authentication, but really they are two separate things. Just in terms of the way we think about things, my identity on Twitter may be the same as my identity sort of somewhere else, but within an enterprise scope, those identities don't necessarily gel together. In a world where identity has so many different sort of providers, where you can't necessarily verify this thing, I mean, how does, as a developer, how does one actually sort of handle this case? I mean, we've got lots of libraries out of there that do authentication, um, but are there tools out there today that sort of say, you know what, I legitimately am this same person across this span of things beyond just grouping them yourself?
That's a really good question. So it's not just that's goes beyond just that actually tries to go to the heart of what identity means, and skirts around some of the questions like, what is my persona? Am I the same person on Twitter as I am on Facebook, as I am on LinkedIn? And sometimes I may wish to be, and sometimes I may not wish to be. What you see a lot of the tools and libraries kind of assuming at this point is that we can create a single identifier. And most of them treat that identifier as an email address these days, which is a terrible identifier, but it's all that we really have right now. Because email addresses are ubiquitous and they're cross-platform. In order to start capturing the notion of I am the same person in these various locations, you then need to start making an assumption that you can have some kind of an identifier between those different locations. And that's kind of what Google was trying to do originally with Google Plus. And they failed because they couldn't articulate that fact. And now we're seeing tools like, the Firebase authentication, which is trying to say, let the user select how they wish to be identified, which platform they wish to make their stand on, and we'll unify all of them under one umbrella. But again, one of the things that they went and assumed was that this email address was going to be the same between these various sites, that the email address was the unifying factor. And that's true in a lot of cases, but it's also dangerous in a lot of cases. It's a very dangerous assumption. So, as long as we're willing to make those kinds of assumptions, we can start to pull these different factors together. And for people who don't want those different services tied together, they're now forced to take actions like using different email aliases for each of their personas that they want to keep separate. And maybe that's reasonable and maybe it's not.
Can you articulate a little bit what you mean when you say that it's a dangerous assumption?
It's dangerous in two ways. The first is that we assume, the presumption basically boils down to that an email address is both unique to an individual and is the only unique identifier for that individual. And furthermore, that it never changes. All three of which are not true. They're reasonable assumptions for a simple model, but they're not true. So I already forgot the order that I listed those in. So let's take them in whatever order I remember. We know that email addresses change over time. Right now, everyone has a Gmail address. But once upon a time, everyone had a Yahoo email address. And before then, everyone had an AOL.com email address. And over time, email addresses come and email addresses go. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So we're essentially saying that your identity service needs to take into account the fact that this unique key may change, which database systems are notorious for not liking. Um, it also assumes that an email address represents a single person. And while that is, largely true, there's still a fairly substantial set of the population for which an email address represents uh, a household or several people or an office that is managed by several people or just a position or a title. So that's not necessarily, something that identifies a single person, which many of our identities might need to. And the final one is that I will only have one email address. And a lot of people, that is very not true. Increasingly, people are using more than one email address. I've got a work email, most people have a work email address and a home email address. And many more may additionally have email addresses representing particular clubs. Wise people will create an email address for different companies that they interact with so that they know when they get spam, who that spam came from. So all of these, in the most simplistic case are true, but they're assumptions that very, very rapidly fall apart. And when they fall apart, they start to undermine the assumptions that we make about how we tie our different personas together into a single identity.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. So you're bringing up a point that I remember hearing at Facebook a few months ago. Gordana Bejdov, she's a brilliant performance and capacity engineer at Facebook, and she's former Googler before that. She said something about how security is really, really, really hard on the internet because fundamentally the internet was just not architected and designed with security in mind. It was supposed to be this open network of trusted, peer-to-peer contacts, and so you're kind of bringing up a similar point in that we're kind of running into fundamental architecture problems about how we have previously thought about identity and have handled it up until now, that are just they're not scaling and they're not working for the scale that we're operating at today. And so I find that really interesting, Alan.
Well, I think this is actually a case, and that's a great point that both you and she make. I think this is also a case, though, where our previous notions of identity were based on what we would now refer to as a web of trust. So, for example, if I would walk around in my community, people knew who I was. They knew who I was by sight. It was visual. That was my identity. If I traveled to some other town, I might carry with me letters of credentials, usually from my bank. And my bank would be trusted because it's a bank. And these letters of credentials would tell somebody else who I was. We see the sorts of things with passports, for example. If you go read the text in your passport, it is technically the Secretary of State telling whoever would happen to see this passport that I am me, for whatever definition of I and me are. But we had this visceral understanding of what that means. As we got more and more distributed, and as the internet has encouraged that kind of distribution, we no longer really have, we don't have a central authority that can say, I am me. And we've had companies like Facebook and Google try to step in and fill that role, but they have done so in some rather imperfect ways because they don't know who we are. So we've gone from this notion of I'm known on sight, and if somebody sees me on the street and doesn't know who I am, they can turn to their neighbor and ask, to who do you ask when someone shows up and says they're Alan Firstenberg? What does it even mean to say that I am Alan Firstenberg? These get into really deep philosophical questions, but they do start illustrating how this very open, very decentralized web of trust has kind of caused identity problems that we haven't figured out how to resolve yet, at least not completely.
I think I'm going to require all my users in future web applications to simply come to a key signing party. I think that's the only way really to do this. That way, I can find two forms of personal identification as well as their cryptographic PGP key. Has anyone here actually ever been to a key signing party? I'm just curious.
Not in a couple of decades, no.
Yeah, I'm thinking BYOK is going to be like the new hipster thing on the internet. It's so funny.
They were so much fun. You used to write things down, and it was fun.
As soon as you say writing things down, it couldn't have been fun.
Well, you got to make sure everyone is, you're changing keys and whatnot. Hey, we got to,
Right.
I can't necessarily test the device you've got in your hand. I don't know who you are.
There's a key party joke in here somewhere that I think I'm going to avoid.
So with all of, so I mean, thank you. You have built the case for me. So I think now that we have our problem statement, can we dive into what is Google identity, and like what problems does it solve? Given the ones that you brought up.
So Google identity, broadly speaking, tries to solve one very small corner of that problem by assuming that everyone has a Google account, which is, again, not an entirely invalid assumption these days. And then providing ways that people can get into their Google account and use that kind of as a signature of trust to something else. So basically, it turns into Google is now playing the role of the Secretary of State, and that when I show up at some other site and say, "Go ahead, ask Google who I am," Google will return some consistent identifier about me. And in order to do that, Google needs to know that, again, we go back to who's the entity on the other end of the keyboard or mobile device or whatever. Google needs some reassurance of what that is. So they've come up with a number of different ways to let you authenticate yourself to Google. And some of these are very traditional. You've got a login and a password. And some of them get better. You've got two-factor authentication. And increasingly, they're coming up with other ways to reassure themselves that you are who you say you are. So there's assumptions of things like, well, if you have a wearable, we can pretty much assume that you're going to keep that wearable on you all the time. It's more difficult to separate you from your watch than it is to separate you from your phone. So if you're coming in with, if your wearable is tethered to your phone and you're doing some other things with your phone, we've got a pretty good chance that it's you. If your behavior then acts in certain ways, if you visit websites that are commonly yours, if you're not, going to your Gmail and then sending out a few thousand pieces of advertising spam, which you've never done before, these are pretty good indicators that you're you. Whereas, if you try to log in and your phone is, in Detroit and your watch is, in Los Angeles, maybe you're not you from either of those devices. Maybe we need to take some additional steps in making sure you're who you say you are. So it's all this combination of things that go into what Google identity services are these days. Um, some of these are very new and very advanced. We saw prototypes of some of them 2 or 3 years back at Google I/O. Just to the point where they can detect how quickly you type in your password, or the patterns that you use to type in a number will differ between people. And if they differ significantly from what you usually type, they'll be a little more suspicious. We're going far beyond what we used to do with CAPTCHA systems, for example. This is trying to look at your behavior and match the identity they think you are to the behavior they normally see you exhibit.
I've got a quick question. So we talked about some of the problems with like services identifying individual users, but what about the other way around? Is there any problems with a user relying on a single system, a single company to be their identity across all these different sites? I know you've got certain level of assurances for that a huge company like Google isn't going to go anywhere, but are there any problems on that side of things?
Well, you say we've got these assurances that Google's not going to go anywhere. That's really a lousy assumption. Let's be honest here. As much as I love Google, assuming that they're going to be a permanent identifier for me is a terrible assumption. And the reason why we know this is because Yahoo used to fill that role, and before them, AOL used to fill that role, and before them, IBM used to fill that role. So we're at a point where we need to build our identity services so that unique identifier may change over time, and that's not something that people really can wrap their heads around.
Yeah, that's a very.
It's not something developers can. It's certainly not something the common person can either.
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. I mean, I said that you can assume that Google's going to be around, but in the past, and companies do all the time, they kind of end products or end services and stuff like that. So even that could happen. And you're right that we've changed.
Right, and Google is not known for ending their products ever. I mean, we all know this, right?
Oh yeah, it's I make that that's why I never look at the deprecation list on a daily basis.
But I mean, if you think about it, for example, in the U.S. we have what we now refer to as a social security number. It's interesting that it's not really possible. Certainly, up until a few years ago, it used to be impossible to get a new social security number, to get one reissued to you. If someone got your social security number, and it used to be not easy to do, but if someone got it somehow, you were in trouble because that was a key to a whole bunch of things. It still is a key to a whole bunch of things, but everyone kind of takes for granted now that identifier has been exposed. Once upon a time, it was a secret key. We've gotten past that. We're now looking at both using that key in association with behavior and other factors. So the social security number is now part of a multi-factor authentication system, if you can think about it that way.
So in the scope of web authentication with Google Identity, Google Identity does a few things that I suppose used to be somewhat more difficult. So the notion of just using sort of your Google Identity to sign into something via one click, not necessarily new. We've all probably used OAuth 2 and sort of done the magical OAuth dance of authentication with a particular account against a particular set of assertions that give us, some set of features and or cross data sharing. But they did attempt to sort of make something that used to be rather hard, single sign-on, a little bit easier. Should we discuss that a little bit and talk about the notion of being signed in multiple places, yet only signing in one spot?
I think we can. I think that starts going into the notions of what I was referring to by saying, they're looking more for patterns They're looking more for habits of you, and they're storing as much as they can and making things easier for you as much as possible. Um, and I think it's you know that's kind of what they're looking for. That's why when when they changed how Capatcha worked a few years back at this point. So instead of having to type in what you see all the time, you just had to click your "I'm not a robot." Um, that whole notion of you can be everywhere, and we can make it as easy on you as possible, is driven by the fact that they can see what our usage patterns look like. And when we go outside those usage patterns, they start to get suspicious. But if we're primarily, logging in and using our Gmail, and we're primarily doing it from the same machine, they can make a lot of assumptions. And those, and how that's done is nicely handled behind the scenes for us as web developers. Um, and that's a real bonus for both us and for our users. Is that where you were going with that, Justin?
Yeah, I think that there is a trade-off between the simplicity of it all and sort of the notion of what that simplicity sort of may come back to haunt you, right? Because
Well,
I can use single sign-on in a lot of cases, and then whether that's with Google Sign-In or something like Auth0, right, which has SSO support. Um, with again that notion of those identities are the same person on the same thing, whether that's me on my desktop or me on my phone.
and I think that's what I was alluding to earlier when I talked about how we as developers need to understand some of the philosophy behind it and understand some of the risk behind it as well. If I am protecting financial information, yeah, I'll use that single sign-in as a first hint, but I'm going to want additional layers. I'm not going to trust just that because there is so much more at stake, so much more for me and so much more for my user. Um, Google sign-in lets us do one part of it, but it doesn't let us do every part of it. And I think that's the thing that we need to understand as developers, is that Google sign in is in some ways a magic bullet for a lot of solutions. It certainly means that we no longer have to build our own, login and password and store and hash them and deal with that. In that sense, it is a big, it's great for us. But we have to understand what its limitations are too. And that's true in any security system. So, when I said before, if we're not approaching it with the right level of trepidation, we need to be.
So Alan, I think it's really interesting. How somebody giggled. What did the word interesting and authentication? Are they just not supposed to be used in the same sentence?
I didn't giggle. I find authentication fascinating.
Okay.
And
like,
that's how I have so many
like,
gray hairs at this point.
Yeah.
well, no, I find it really interesting how this machine learning, right, and these like neural networks that are being formed to kind of capture our habits and patterns. But those are also really, I think, what Justin was alluding to is they're very susceptible to social hacking as well, right? And so it's definitely not it's not a buck stops here solution, but it's definitely one form of it's one front on the battle, right? So
Right. Well, but you know what? It never is. If we go back to way before computers and we look at real world authentication systems, if I walked into my bank, my local bank, the teller knew me, the bank manager knew me. If I walked in every week and I deposited some money and, maybe took out some money once in a while, that was a pattern that they would recognize. And if I suddenly came in one day and asked to close my account, that would raise alarms. They would be concerned that there was something wrong. Um, and maybe they would strawl while they tried to find out what it was, and maybe they would try to take me into a separate room and chat with me and find out why. But if I act strangely in a physical space, those strange patterns are noticed by people that know me. And if you try to scale that up, you now need to start applying artificial intelligence to do those same sorts of things. And that's what we're seeing again. Credit card companies doing. A number of credit card companies, for example, have ditched requiring a personal signature. And the reason is because they found it wasn't doing anything in terms of fraud prevention. What was doing something in terms of fraud prevention were studying our purchasing patterns. And if we suddenly started making not even necessarily big ticket purchases, but just purchases that seemed out of the ordinary, they might try to slow things down while they tried to get a hold of us, or while they flagged it, or while they tried to figure out what was going on.
Someone swiped my card while I was in the UK and bought a shed. A shed, like a structure. They bought a building.
They bought a building.
That's not something we do all the time, though. Just so everybody's just listening, people don't steal things to buy sheds in England. Just saying.
Last time I checked, England stole countries. Is that not a thing? I'm just
dear.
That was below the belt. You know what? The British history is something that, like, it's a fascinating topic for me personally. But anyways,
and you can listen to that on our sister podcast, History.
Back to Identity. Yeah, I'm all rambling about history. Drunk History. Drunk History is a great show for anybody who has not watched it. But Alan, again, all these are really fascinating points. I'm really curious to hear about two things, because I know you're like this IoT expert. You dabble a lot with different devices. You're a GDE for IoT, expert on home, etc. And so, I'm really curious to see if there's a story there for IoT security and Google Identity. And additionally, I'm also curious about what the cross-platform story is for Google Identity, right? So Android, iOS, web, etc. So it's a loaded question, a few questions I'm hoping you can answer.
Yeah, I'm hoping I can answer them too. Let me start with the easy one. The cross-platform solution is that, and that's part of what Google is doing with Google Identity, is they want to be able to say, if you're here on Android, if you're here on the web, no matter how you've come to us, you're the same you. And in fact, we'll now start using these different devices to help prove that you're the same you. So, so I don't even remember if this is still works, but there were times when you would be able to go to your Chrome OS device, and as long as you were wearing a Android Wear watch, it would assume could automatically log you in immediately. So those sorts of cross-platform identity tools are certainly there. Two-factor authentication, it assumes that if you can receive messages on your phone, you'll be able to log in through the web. These are fairly standard types of things these days. When you start talking Internet of Things, you're now entering a huge, huge nightmare. And part of that is, well, it's the sort of thing that we saw with Google Home when it first came out, is that you could only attach one account to it. And that's fine if you're by yourself in an apartment, and it doesn't make sense if you're in a family household of, some adults and some kids. Fortunately, Google very, very quickly was able to release an update for Home that lets you do things like set the voice triggering hot word, tie it to a particular voice, and tying that to a particular account. So that now I can set my Google Home up so that when I trigger it with my voice, it knows to do further things with my account. And if my son triggers it with his voice, it does further things with his account. And if somebody else happens to be in my house and tries to trigger it, they're going to get a more anonymous and generic configuration. So that's okay for something that's voice triggered. But we're still seeing a lot of confusion on it. One of the problems with Android TV, for example, or at least Android TV the last time I looked at it, was that you can only have one account logged into it. And that again falls apart when you're dealing with multiple people. Netflix, finally, years ago, they realized that no, yes, there were probably a lot of people that liked both Star Wars and My Little Pony, but probably not as many as they were seeing. And most of those cases, not all, but most of those cases were probably adults who were watching Star Wars, but who were then leaving their Netflix account around for the kids to watch My Little Pony. Once they introduced profiles, you saw a lot less of this bizarre crossover recommendations. I think that's where the Internet of Things needs to go, but we are far from that point yet. And Google provides only a modest amount of support for how to deal with that. You see things like the Android Nearby library will help with some of that. So, for example, an IoT, if I'm trying to control an IoT device through my phone or my watch, the nearby system can transmit who I am, and the device can ask it, who are you? But for routine things like a light switch, it's not going to be reading my fingerprint as I turn the light on. So, and yet the switch needs to have some kind of identity attached to it. It needs some kind of connection to what the rest of the house is, and the rest of the house needs to make sure that only authorized people can do things like turn the lights on and off, and related tasks like that. I don't want people not in my household randomly turning lights on and off in the middle of the night, or turning the heat all the way down in the middle of winter or something.
I do think it's interesting to think about identity not necessarily as almost as a more abstract concept of not tied to a person, but just knowing that this one entity, whatever this one entity is the same as this other is the same as, well, not the same as this other entity, but these two bits of information are coming from the same entity, whatever that entity might be, and however it's identified.
Yeah, it's a tough notion for a lot of security people even to get their heads around, because we have this this predisposition, this assumption that people will protect their login. People will, you've got a login and a password, and we've been drilling it into people for years. Don't give out your login and password to someone else. But there are cases where you want to do that, where it's important that you do that. So, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad that you've done so, just we need to understand why. And if you think about it, we've actually been doing this, again, if we look at a real world counterparts. And I like to try to associate things with real world counterparts and real world risks, because people understand those a bit better. We give people keys to our house all the time. If somebody is, if we're trusting someone to come in and water our plants and look after our pets when we're on vacation, we'll give them a key, and we are really kind of hoping that they're not going to make a duplicate of that key and do something nefarious with it later. And fortunately, there are very, very few cases where that's true. In the same way, sometimes we want to give people our login and password. There are lots of cases where parents will give kids the login and password so they can go do something online, because that's the only legitimate way they have to do it. And until we as developers find better solutions, and we're starting to, that's what we're going to, we're going to end up doing that. We're going to end up trusting that we've given our kids permission to represent us under certain circumstances.
When you think about it, one of the, I think, most common scenarios of, because I'm sure a lot of people now is like, I never share my password with anybody. The most common thing everybody does that with is your home Wi-Fi router. You have friends and family and whoever come over, and you probably pretty freely give out that, even if it's hidden, giving out the router name and the password to access it.
Right. Because, how else are you going to do it? But even, we think of that as something that, everyone does with Wi-Fi. Even before then, though, it was pretty common for people to just give their kids or their spouse a credit card. And there was, this assumption that if you had the credit card, you had access to the funds behind it. Long silence as everyone is pondering when the last time they gave somebody else a credit card was.
Oh, it is terrifying to think about just handing to almost to anybody, especially a child. Be like, hey, you can have this. I remember it being something I would see in movies where it's just like, oh, my dad gave me this credit card for emergencies, and then their friends would convince them to go out and buy other stuff.
But let me ask you something. The last time you went out to dinner at a restaurant, okay, did you go over to the payment terminal yourself?
No, absolutely not.
No, you handed your credit card to the waitstaff, and they went over to the payment terminal, and they probably brought you back a piece of paper to sign.
Yeah.
Except for the person in England who has a more, real payment system.
And a new shed.
They're like, these Americans, I just told him to give me his credit card and he just gave it to me. It's like,
but in terms of security, we basically handed over a key to an agent, and that's acceptable in our society. We understand that, we accepted those risks. But here's a case where we literally handed over a security identifier to somebody who we hope are going to act on our behalf, and 98% of the time they do, and occasionally we see some fraudulent activity with it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Danny, what you talked about, I believe there were two of my favorite movies in the 90s. One was Home Alone, and the other was, I think, Blank Check. So those are real movies. but anyways, so Alan, I'm wondering, we don't have that much time left. I'm wondering if we can kind of just briefly compare, discuss some success stories of people who using Google, or companies using Google Identity.
Broadly speaking, what I think I'm seeing with a lot of companies that are using Google Identity is they had started with a system that, they had started with a login and password system that they were managing themselves. And they were trying to get to a point where they could just simplify how to do things. And in some cases, that was, in a lot of cases, actually, that was because either an audit or a hacker identified a problem with how they were storing their own accounts. And in doing so, they were able to switch to something like the Google Identity Service and eliminate a major security vulnerability. And in doing so, yes, it meant they were putting their trust in Google. But let's be honest. I've done security for a number of years. I'm sure a bunch of us have ended up having to do security roles at one point or another. I would certainly rather trust somebody like Google or a company like Facebook or companies who have people who are thinking about security full time, more than full time, to do it right and to help me do it right as well. Way back, decades ago at this point, I did security full time. And I lasted in that for a year and a half. And the reason I left is because I wanted to sleep at night. And I couldn't as a security officer. It just wasn't possible. I couldn't get enough people to do things the right way. Google has the force, the momentum, and the people and the smarts to get people to do things the right way, to kind of, work with others. They do work with Facebook. They do work with all of these groups to create reasonable protocols and ways to do things and help push the industry as a whole, push all of us developers to go down this path. It's been a long time since I had one of my clients come to me and say, I want a login system and I want to be able to control the username and password myself. More and more of my clients are saying things like, how do I tie into Google's identity service? Or how do I tie into an existing OpenID Connect server? Or where they absolutely need to, how do I create an OpenID Connect server that ties into other authentication systems? So more and more we're seeing, and I think that is the biggest thing that Google and their cohorts were able to do, is get people to start standardizing on good ways of doing security.
I think that's a really good point. For smaller companies, it's just too hard to think about all of these terrifying security issues, especially with identity. So being able to rely on a big company like that, as you said, that has the time and the resources to do it right is really important. This whole conversation has been really insightful and really interesting to consider identity in the way that we've been talking about it. I think it's overlooked quite a lot. I know I certainly overlook it quite often, but we're running out of time now. So before we wrap up, have you got any resources such as blogs or courses or books or anything along those lines that people you'd recommend people read to learn more about this subject, learn more about Google identity, etc.?
The best thing as always is to go to developers.google.com. They've got tons and tons of resources there, specifically developers.google.com/identity talks about Google's identity stuff, stuff that I blog and stuff that I talk about, and presentations I make are all available at prisoner.com.
Cool.
Talking about identity and security.
Excellent. We'll make sure we get those links in the show notes as well so people can access them easily. Is there anything else that we missed that you'd like to share?
I'd say yes, except then we could really start going down rabbit holes and continue on for another couple of hours. So no, I think we've hit good stopping points.
We would be here for weeks, it seems like, trying to cover the wide range of things that can sort of come up when we start to talk about authentication. Alan, thank you so much for coming on the show today, though. We'll have to have you back to discuss things like JWIT and other interesting things that people are doing with authentication on the web today. If people want to find you, how would they find you on the internet of things? You talked about your website, Twitter, anything of that nature? What's the easiest way to find you?
Easiest ways to find me, all of my locations are linked to from prisoner.com. If you're trying to get a message to me, best place to get a message to me is on Google Plus, however. And I post a ton of answers to stuff on Stack Overflow as Prisoner.
Fantastic. Leon, Amal, anything else to add before we wrap up this episode?
No, just thank you for coming on and sharing all that really useful information.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. You're just incredible, and really personal thank you from me because I've seen you do a number of talks and teaching a lot of different folks, and you're a wonderful teacher, and you're really passionate about what you do, and you're like a true technology enthusiast. So thank you so much, Alan, for everything you do, and yeah.
Well, thank you for having me on. It is always fun to ramble on for 45 minutes or so about topics such as this. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed it and maybe learned a little bit. I know I always do.
And that's a good place to wrap up this episode of the Web Platform Podcast. This has been episode number 146, Web Authentication with Google Identity. We've talked about a wide range of topics. Do check the new website that just got released, where we'll have all the resources as well as all the links to today's This Week in Web. We hope to see you next week when we'll be talking with another expert on their tools of choice. And we hope you have a fine rest of your week. Thanks, everybody.